London, May 19, 1536. A grey sky dawned over the Tower of London. In the inner courtyard, a scaffold of light-colored wood had been erected during the night. Not an ordinary scaffold with a raised platform, but a lower structure adapted to accommodate something unusual. A foreign executioner, whispers spread. Today, a queen will be executed, the first in England's history. Anne Boleyn, the woman who triggered the break with Rome and revolutionized the kingdom, will face her destiny this morning. Within the tower walls, in a small chamber that has been her prison for the past 17 days. Anne awakens to her last day of life. At 35, she still maintains the elegance that once captivated the most powerful king in England. Her ladies-in-waiting, the few who remained loyal, help her dress. Anne has carefully chosen a dark gray mantle, lined with fur, beneath which she wears a crimson bodice, colors that will not show blood, a choice both practical and dignified. My choice of attire is a final act of defiance, she reportedly told her ladies, to show the world I remain a queen, even in death. I hear the executioner is very good. I have a little neck, Anne remarks, gracefully touching her own throat. This comment, recorded by witnesses, reveals not only courage, but a dark irony in the face of the inevitable. How did Anne Boleyn come to this terrible end? Daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard of noble lineage, Anne grew up partly in the sophisticated French court, where she absorbed Renaissance culture and the refinement that would later distinguish her. Her time in France, serving Queen Claude, honed her wit and charm, making her a standout among English ladies, as noted in diplomatic correspondence of the era. Upon returning to England around 1522, she was not considered a great beauty. With olive skin, black hair, and dark eyes, she diverged from the Renaissance ideal of pale complexion and blonde hair. But she possessed something more valuable, a sharp intelligence, knowledge of languages and arts, and a magnetic presence that drew everyone around her. When Henry VI, whose marriage to Catherine of Aragon was not producing the much-desired male heir, turned his eyes to Anne, she refused to follow in the footsteps of her sister Mary Boleyn, who had already been the king's mistress. I will not be your concubine, she reportedly told the monarch. If you want my heart and body, you must give me a crown. This bold stance, recorded in letters from courtiers, shocked the court, cementing her reputation as a woman who wielded power unconventionally. A risky gamble, but one that would forever change English history. For 7 years, from 1526 to 1533, Henry pursued Anne with an obsession that transformed the kingdom. To marry her, he broke with the Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the new Church of England, faced opposition from the Pope and Emperor Charles V, and revolutionized his country's religious structure. Chronicles from the time, such as those by Edward Hall, describe Henry's letters to Anne as fervent and desperate, revealing a king consumed by desire and willing to defy Europe's mightiest power. In January 1533, Anne and Henry married secretly when she was already pregnant. In September, Anne gave birth, to the king's great disappointment, to a girl. Anne's reign lasted only 3 years, but her impact was profound. Intelligent and incisive, she promoted religious reforms, patronized scholars, and circulated English translations of the Bible, then forbidden. Her support for William Tyndale's Bible translations, as documented in Reformation histories, made her a target for conservative clergy who branded her a dangerous reformer. To her admirers, she was a visionary. To her enemies, and they were many, a manipulative heretic. Her downfall began with reproductive failures. After Elizabeth, Anne became pregnant again, but suffered a miscarriage in 1534. A third pregnancy in 1535 also ended in miscarriage, this time of a male fetus. For a king obsessed with a male heir, these failures were unforgivable. Court records indicate Henry began to court Jane Seymour openly during Anne's final pregnancy, a public humiliation that fueled Anne's desperation, as reported by Spanish ambassador Eustace Chatbuy. As Henry's love cooled, Anne's enemies gained strength, especially Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. In April 1536, the conspiracy to overthrow Anne gathered momentum. Cromwell orchestrated an investigation into the Queen's supposed improper conduct. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The accusations were as grave as they were absurd. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, conspiracy against the king's life, and treason. Cromwell's letters, preserved in state archives, reveal he fabricated evidence, including coerced confessions from musicians like Mark Smeaton, to ensure Anne's conviction. Her trial on May 15th was a legal farce. Without the right to an attorney, or to confront witnesses, the Queen was subjected to a tribunal composed almost entirely of political enemies. Despite this, Anne defended herself with eloquence. A witness described how she answered everything so wisely and discreetly that she seemed not a woman, but an angel. It didn't matter. The verdict had been determined before the trial even began. Guilty, with a sentence of death by burning, the traditional punishment for female treason. Showing a final flash of mercy, or perhaps merely concerned with international public opinion, Henry commuted the sentence to beheading and ordered that a specialist be brought from France. The French executioner was an expert in the use of the sword, promising a swift and relatively painless death. Back to May 19, 1536, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Anne received news that her execution had been postponed until noon, a cruel blow, as she had already prepared herself psychologically for the end. The additional hours were spent in prayer. Witnesses report that she took communion, and during prayer stopped several times to say, "Lord, have mercy on me." A priest who attended her noted in his diary, preserved in the British Library, that Anne's composure was unearthly, as if she were already reconciled with God. At one point she swore upon the sacred host that she had never betrayed the king, saying, "For my salvation I am free for which I was condemned." At noon, the drums began to sound. Anne bid farewell to her ladies, giving each a small gift as a memento: a prayer book, a handkerchief, a piece of jewelry. "Remember me and how I end." Most of those present removed their hats when Anne appeared, dressed in gray and crimson, walking with the dignity that had always characterized her. On the scaffold, Anne was granted permission to make a final speech. Her words were carefully chosen. "Good Christians, I come here to die according to the law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." These words, transcribed by chronicler William Kingston, were a calculated act of loyalty, designed to shield her daughter Elizabeth from Henry's wrath, as historians like Alison Weir have argued. These words reveal an extraordinary woman. Even facing an unjust death, Anne did not proclaim her innocence nor attack her enemies. It was a masterful political move. By presenting herself as a loyal subject to the end, she preserved the dignity of the crown and indirectly protected the future of her daughter Elizabeth. After her speech, Anne removed her mantle and cap, handing them to her ladies. One of her last gestures was to give a purse of gold coins to the executioner, payment for a job well done. She then knelt on the scaffold, but noticed there was no block to rest her head on, as in executions with an axe. Beheadings with a sword required the condemned to remain kneeling upright. One of her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. Anne continued to move her lips in prayer. "Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The executioner, following French tradition, employed a merciful trick to distract Anne. "Where is my sword?" he asked aloud, although he had already silently positioned the weapon. When Anne turned her head slightly toward the voice, the executioner delivered the blow with brutal precision. The blade cut through the slender neck, separating the head from the body in a single motion. There was a momentary silence, followed by a collective sigh from the crowd. The executioner picked up the head by the hair and raised it, proclaiming, "So perish the king's enemies." But there was no customary roar of approval. Instead, only an uneasy murmur traveled through those present. The imperial ambassador Chapois wrote to Charles V. that the crowd's silence was unprecedented, reflecting unease at the execution of a queen who many believed was innocent. At that moment, the thunder of cannon resounded through the tower, echoing across the Thames River. It was the signal for Henry VI, who was waiting at his Whitehall palace, that he was free to marry again. The next day, he became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. 10 days later, they were married. Anne's body was collected by her ladies, a brutal peculiarity. No proper coffin had been provided for the former queen. Improvising, the guards found an empty arrow chest, where Anne's body, with the head placed beside the trunk, was carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower itself. There, under the stone floor without tombstone or marking, Anne was hastily buried in an anonymous grave. Henry VI ordered that all portraits of Anne be destroyed, her emblems removed from palaces, and her name struck from official records. This erasure was so thorough that, as historian David Starkey notes, even her letters were burned, leaving only fragments of her voice and surviving diplomatic reports. This damnation memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was so effective that to this day there exists no authenticated contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn. However, if Henry intended to completely erase Anne's influence, he failed spectacularly. 23 years after her execution, her daughter Elizabeth ascended to the English throne. Elizabeth I would rule England for 45 years, in a reign considered a golden age. The daughter surpassed the father in almost every aspect, and her greatest legacy was the stability that Henry had so sought. Elizabeth's adoption of her mother's motto, Semper Eadem, meaning always the same, was a subtle tribute, as recorded in royal genealogies, signaling her intent to honor Anne's memory. In 1876, during a restoration of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, bones were discovered in the place where Anne was believed to have been buried. Among them, a female skeleton with delicate bone structure and a small skull was identified as likely being Anne's. These remains were reburied with more dignity. Today, the site of Anne's execution is marked by a simple glass slab on the Tower of London's lawn. Each year on the anniversary of her death, roses are laid there by admirers. For many, Anne Boleyn represents not just a tragic figure, but a symbol of historical injustice and the price that powerful women frequently paid. The final irony is that her triumph came through the daughter whom Henry considered a disappointment. Elizabeth I, upon assuming the throne, deliberately cultivated characteristics of her mother, even adopting the white falcon emblem of the Boleyn. As historian Susan Bordeaux writes in her 2013 study, Elizabeth's refusal to marry was a direct lesson from Anne's fate, ensuring she would never face the vulnerability her mother endured. Learning from her mother's fate, Elizabeth never married, declaring herself married to England. The Virgin Queen built her successful reign upon the ashes of her mother's sacrifice, a sacrifice that began on that gray May morning in 1536, when a queen walked with dignity to her death.